The coffee was always too hot by the time it reached the general. Not because anyone was slow, not because the machine in the operations hallway ran poorly. It was too hot because the walk from the east corridor to the main briefing room at Forward Operating Base. Keller took exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and General Raymond Holt liked his coffee at precisely the temperature it stopped being scalding, which required it to sit for 6 minutes, not 4. Captain Elena Marsh had figured this out on her 3rd day. She started leaving the East Corridor 2 minutes later than everyone expected her to. Nobody noticed the adjustment. They just noticed that the general stopped complaining about the coffee, and since nobody connected that change to the quiet woman carrying the tray, nobody said anything about it at all. That was more or less how Elena's first 2 weeks at FOB Keller went. She was 29 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, a pressed uniform that carried no combat patch on the right shoulder, at least not one anyone thought to look at closely, and a manner so contained it bordered on invisible. She spoke when spoken to. She answered questions with the minimum number of words that counted as a complete sentence. She did not offer opinions. She did not linger after briefings. She collected folders, distributed agendas, confirmed attendance lists, and made sure the projector in Conference Room B didn't do the thing it did where the display cut out every 40 minutes, unless someone held the HDMI cable at a slight angle. She had learned about the cable on day 1. Colonel Dennis Briggs, General Holt's chief of staff, had assigned her to the administrative support role with the kind of efficiency that came from a man who sorted people very quickly and very permanently. He had looked at her transfer papers for approximately 8 seconds, noted her most recent posting, a logistics coordination unit in Bahrain, and handed the folder back to his own clerk without finishing it. "Scheduling, correspondence, pre-brief setup," he said, already looking at something else. "Captain Ewan will show you the system. Morning briefings are at 0600. Don't be late and don't interrupt." Elena said, "Understood, sir." Briggs didn't look up again. Captain Ewan, to his credit, was thorough. He walked her through the filing architecture, the color-coded briefing binders, the general's preference for printed materials over digital displays during operational planning sessions. He explained which colonels took cream in their coffee and which ones would consider the offer an insult. He told her that the safe in the records room needed to be jiggled left before it would open, and that if she ever walked in on Major Gaines eating lunch at his desk, she should back out quietly and pretend it hadn't happened because Gaines got strange about people seeing him eat. It was a lot of small, specific, human information, the kind that required actual attention to absorb. Elena absorbed it. She absorbed everything. That was, if anyone had thought to notice, one of the more unusual things about her. Most people in administrative support roles moved through the operational center with their eyes on the task in front of them, the folder to deliver, the chair to arrange, the signature to collect. Elena moved through it the same way, except that her eyes, while appearing to focus on the task, were also taking in everything peripheral to it. The map on the south wall of the main briefing room, for instance. It had been there since she arrived. A large-scale topographic rendering of a 30-kilometer operational corridor, with overlay markings in 2 different colors, one from what appeared to be an older planning session, one newer. She had noticed it on her first morning when she came in to arrange the chairs before the 0600 brief. She noticed it again on the second morning. By the 4th morning, she had the major terrain features memorized without having deliberately tried to memorize them, because that was simply what her brain did with maps. On the morning of her 12th day at FOB Keller, she was setting out the water carafes along the briefing table when Lieutenant Colonel Harmon walked in early and caught her looking at the map. Harmon was a tall man with the particular brand of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything in his professional life, or at least from never having been told so. He looked at Elena, then at the map, then back at Elena with the expression of someone who had caught a golden retriever sitting in a chair. "You know what that is?" he asked. Not unkindly, just with the tone of a man who already knew the answer. "Topographic overlay of the Sirhan corridor, sir," Elena said. Looks like the shaded relief markings on the eastern edge were updated more recently than the western section. Harmon blinked. Then he smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. Stick to the carafes, Captain. He took his seat at the table. Elena finished arranging the water carafes. She did not say anything else. She collected her tray and moved toward the door, and as she did, she let her eyes pass one more time across the eastern edge of the map. Just briefly, just for a half-second, and she noted the elevation markings along the drainage corridor that ran parallel to Route 7. She noted them, and then she walked out of the room and went to get the General's coffee. She left the east corridor 2 minutes late, as usual. The coffee arrived at exactly the right temperature. Nobody noticed that either the operation had a name by the end of that week. Operation Ironclad. Elena heard it for the first time the way she heard most things at FOB Keller. Not because anyone told her, but because she was in the room when it was said. And being in the room was something people had stopped accounting for. It was a nighttime raid. That much was clear from the first planning session she sat in on. Positioned at the small side table near the door with a notepad and a printed attendance roster, her pen moving at the intervals that suggested she was recording action items and nothing more. The target was a fortified compound approximately 18 kilometers northeast of the corridor she had been studying on the south wall map. High value, time sensitive. The kind of operation that had a gravitational pull on everyone in the building. The kind that made colonels walk faster and lieutenants stand up straighter, and the whole base shift into a register that hummed just below the surface of normal routine. Elena recorded the action items. She also recorded everything else. The assault element would move in 2 ground vehicles and 1 air asset. Ingress was planned along a route that skirted the eastern edge of the Siren corridor before cutting north through a narrow access road to the compound's rear approach. The timing was built around a weather window, a low cloud ceiling that would reduce visibility for any external surveillance on the target. 48 hours out from the window, the plan was already largely fixed. What remained was coordination, logistics, communication checks, medical support staging, and the administrative details that fell to people like Elena to organize into binders and distribute to the relevant parties before close of business. She distributed them. She organized them. She did not comment on them. What she did, on her own time and without announcement, was quietly restructure the pre-operation briefing schedule. It was a small change. The original schedule had the communications verification block and the medical staging review running back-to-back in the same 90-minute window, with the logistics confirmation squeezed into the final 15 minutes before the General's afternoon session. Anyone who had run an operational timeline knew that 15 minutes was not enough. That logistics confirmation had a way of surfacing last-minute discrepancies that needed at least 30 minutes of buffer to resolve without bleeding into the General's time. Elena moved the medical staging review to the morning, opened up 45 minutes in the afternoon block, and redistributed the updated schedule without a cover note or explanation. She just sent it. Captain Ewan noticed. He looked at the revised version for a long moment, then looked across the office toward Elena's desk, where she was working through a stack of supply manifests with the focused quiet of someone doing a crossword puzzle. "Did you adjust the afternoon block?" he asked. "The logistics confirmation needed more time," she said. Ewan looked at the schedule again. "Briggs approved this? It didn't require his approval. It's a scheduling adjustment within existing parameters." She turned a page on the manifest. "If it causes a problem, I'll revert it." It didn't cause a problem. The afternoon ran 40 minutes smoother than it would have. Colonel Briggs, who had been bracing for the logistics confirmation to run long and eat into the General's session, found himself with time to spare and used it to get a second cup of coffee and return 3 calls he'd been putting off. He did not connect any of this to Elena. Lieutenant Garvey did, though. Or rather, he noticed that something had changed without being able to identify what. Garvey was 24, recently promoted, and operated with the loud, easy confidence of someone who had tested well on every evaluation he'd ever taken. He had established early on that Elena was administrative support and had adjusted his behavior toward her accordingly, which meant he handed her folders without looking at her and occasionally left his own empty coffee cup on the edge of her desk, as though the desk were an extension of the break room. On the third day of ironclad planning, he paused in the corridor outside Conference Room B and said to another lieutenant, loud enough to carry, "You think they even tell her what the op is? Or does she just think we're planning a really complicated supply run?" The other lieutenant laughed. Elena, coming around the corner behind them with a stack of updated binders, heard the whole thing. She didn't break stride. She walked past them, distributed the binders to the conference room table, and on her way back out paused just long enough to hand Garvey the top copy of the corrected attendance roster, which she had noticed contained 2 errors, and said, "You were listed twice in Section 3. I fixed it." She kept walking. Garvey looked at the roster. He had been listed twice in Section 3. He didn't say anything, but the other lieutenant stopped laughing, and the silence that followed had a slightly different texture than the silence before. It was Sergeant Major Diaz who saw it. Diaz was 43, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by exposure to every climate the Army had access to, and a manner that was so thoroughly unhurried it occasionally made junior officers nervous. He was the senior NCO attached to the operations cell, which meant he saw everything that moved through FOB Keller and had long since developed the ability to distinguish between people who were present and people who were paying attention. Most people in administrative roles were present. Elena Marsh was paying attention. He had noticed it first with the map. The way her eyes had moved across it that morning, Harmon caught her looking. The particular stillness that came over her face, which was not the stillness of someone spacing out, but the stillness of someone processing. He had seen that look before, in rooms very different from this one. He had not said anything about it. He watched instead. He watched her at the planning sessions. He watched the way she sat at the side table with her notepad, pen moving, eyes forward, and the way those eyes tracked the briefings in a manner that was fractionally too precise for someone just recording action items. He watched her cross-reference the supply manifests against the operational timeline with an ease that suggested she understood what the timeline was for, not just what it said. On the evening before the mission was scheduled to launch, he walked past the records room and found the door slightly ajar. Through it, he could hear the soft, efficient sound of pages turning. He stopped. Through the gap, he could see Elena at the records table, the operational brief open in front of her. Not the summary version distributed to support staff. The full brief, the one that had been left on the conference table after the final planning session and had not yet been filed. She had a separate page beside her, a logistics report, from what he could see, and she was moving between the 2 documents with the focused, economical attention of someone running a cross-check. Diaz stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he walked on. He did not report what he had seen. He did not go back to his bunk either. He went to his desk in the operations cell and pulled up the same logistics report on his terminal, the one she had been reading, and he began to look at it himself, methodically, the way a man does when something is telling him to look and he's learned to trust that feeling. He was halfway through it when he found the rainfall data. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ingress route on his screen, the planned approach along the eastern drainage corridor, and he sat with what he was seeing for a long, quiet moment. Then he looked at the clock. 14 hours to launch. The rainfall data was not classified. That was the thing that made it worse, in a way. It wasn't buried in a restricted file or locked behind a clearance level that only a handful of people at FOB Keller could access. It was sitting in a regional logistics report that had been distributed to the operations cell 9 days ago as a routine weather and infrastructure update. The kind of document that got filed and forgotten because it contained information about road conditions and supply route accessibility and other things that mattered enormously to the people moving equipment and not at all, apparently, to the people moving assault teams. Elena had found it on page 11. The report noted, in the dry, precise language of someone who wrote logistics assessments for a living, that the eastern drainage corridor running parallel to Route 7 had received sustained rainfall over the previous 2 weeks, at a rate significantly above the seasonal average. The corridor's natural grade and soil composition made it prone to water retention. At the recorded rainfall levels, the report estimated that the lower sections of the corridor, specifically the 400-meter stretch between grid references that Elena had already committed to memory, would be holding between 60 and 90 centimeters of standing water. The ingress route for Operation Ironclad ran directly through that stretch. The assault team's ground vehicles were standard utility platforms. They had a water-fording depth of approximately 50 centimeters under operational load. The mission planners had built the approach around the corridor being passable. They had checked the road surface. They had checked the bridge integrity at the northern crossing. They had checked everything except the drainage corridor itself, because the drainage corridor wasn't a road. It was a cut through the terrain that the route used as cover for the final approach, and it wasn't the kind of thing that showed up on the standard infrastructure checklist. Elena had run the numbers twice. She did it the first time quickly, the way you do when you want to be wrong and are checking to confirm it. She pulled the gradient data from the topographic overlay, matched it against the rainfall accumulation figures, applied the standard retention coefficient for that soil classification, and got a water depth range of 58 to 84 centimeters, well above the vehicle's fording capacity. She did it the second time slowly, the way you do when you already know the answer and are making sure you can defend every step of it. She got the same result. She sat with it for a moment. The records room was quiet. The overhead light was the kind of flat, institutional white that made everything look slightly more serious than it already was. Outside, the base had settled into its late evening rhythm, the particular kind of not quite silence that operational installations maintained when something large was in motion, a hum of readiness underneath the stillness. Elena closed the logistics report. She closed the operational brief. She stacked them neatly, the way they had been when she found them, and she sat for another moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she picked up both documents and walked to Colonel Briggs's office. His light was on. She could see it under the door. She knocked twice, heard him say, "Come in," and entered to find him at his desk with reading glasses on, working through what looked like personnel paperwork. He looked up with the expression of a man who had been interrupted doing something tedious and was cautiously open to the interruption being worth it. "Captain," he said. "Sir, I need to flag something in the ironclad brief." She set the logistics report on the desk in front of him and opened it to page 11. The ingress route uses the eastern drainage corridor between these two grid references. She pointed. Based on rainfall accumulation data in this report, that section is likely holding 60 to 90 centimeters of standing water. The assault vehicles can't ford that under operational load. The approach becomes impassable. Briggs looked at the page. He looked at it for long enough that Elena thought, for a moment, that he was actually reading it. Then he took his glasses off. "Where did you get the operational brief?" he said. "It was on the conference room table after the final planning session. It hadn't been filed yet. That brief is not part of your assigned materials." Elena kept her voice level. "Sir, I understand that. But the route was planned and verified by this operations cell over the course of 2 weeks." He set his glasses on the desk. "By people who are qualified to plan it. The logistics report wasn't cross-referenced against the route plan. The rainfall data—" "Captain," his voice was not raised. It was the voice of a man who had learned that a certain quietness communicated more authority than volume. "Your job here is administrative support. Whatever you think you found, the appropriate thing was to bring it to Captain Ewan, not walk into my office the night before a launch with a logistics report and a theory." Elena looked at him steadily. "It's not a theory, sir. It's a calculation based on documented data. I can walk you through it." "That won't be necessary." He picked his glasses back up. "File the brief. Get some sleep. The operation launches in 14 hours, and I need this cell functioning, not second-guessing finalized plans based on supply route paperwork." He looked back down at his personnel files. "Close the door on your way out." She stood there for one more second. Not out of defiance. Out of the particular discipline required to accept an outcome you disagree with through the proper channel before deciding what to do next. Then she closed the door. She stood in the corridor outside his office and looked at the logistics report still in her hand. The bass hum continued around her. That low, operational readiness frequency that meant people were moving, checking equipment, running communication tests, doing all the things that led toward a launch in 14 hours. 14 hours. She thought about the 400-meter stretch of corridor. She thought about 60 to 90 centimeters of standing water in the dark. She thought about vehicles stalling out mid-approach and an assault team exposed in a drainage ditch with no cover and no forward movement, and a target compound that would have heard the engines. She started walking. Captain Ewan was not at his desk. She tried the communications room, the break room, the small equipment bay off the south corridor. She found a specialist who told her Ewan had gone to the motor pool to oversee the vehicle prep and wasn't expected back until after 2200. She looked at her watch. 21:18. She went to the motor pool. Ewan was deep in conversation with a maintenance sergeant about a fuel line issue on the second vehicle, which was its own problem and apparently had been for 3 days. And when he saw Elena approach, he held up one finger without looking at her and kept talking. She waited. She waited for 4 minutes while they worked through the fuel line issue, and when Ewan finally turned to her, she laid out the drainage corridor problem in under 90 seconds, clearly and without embellishment. Ewan listened. He was a careful, conscientious officer who did not dismiss things reflexively, which was why Elena had come to him. But when she finished, he rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the logistics report with the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they didn't want to step into. "Briggs already said no," he asked. "He told me to file it." Ewan was quiet for a moment. "Elena, if Briggs reviewed it and he didn't review it. He asked me where I got the brief and told me my job was administrative support." Another silence. The maintenance sergeant had found somewhere else to be. "The math is sound," she said. "I can show you the calculation. It takes 5 minutes." Ewan looked at the report. He looked at the motor pool around them, the vehicles being prepped, the controlled motion of people doing their jobs inside a timeline. He was a good officer. She could see him weighing it honestly. "I can't go over Briggs to the general on this," he said finally. "Not the night before a launch. Not without. It would have to be airtight, and even then, it is airtight. Elena." He said her name the way people did when they were about to say something they weren't comfortable saying. "Even if you're right. Even if the numbers are exactly right. The way this works, I can't." "I know," she said. She took the logistics report back. She looked at it once more. "Thank you, sir," she said, and walked back toward the operations building. She was calm. That was the thing about having been in rooms where the stakes were very high and the options were very limited. It produced a particular kind of calm that had nothing to do with the situation being okay, and everything to do with having already decided what came next. She knew what came next. She walked toward the general's private briefing room, where the light was still on. The door to General Holt's private briefing room was not closed. It was open by about 4 inches. Not an invitation. Just the particular inattention of a man so deep in his own work that the door had stopped registering as a thing that required a decision. Through the gap, Elena could see the edge of the planning table, a corner of the operational map taped to the standing board, and the general himself seated at the far end with his reading glasses on and a red pen moving steadily across a printed document. He was alone. Elena stood in the corridor for exactly 1 breath. Then she knocked twice on the open door and pushed it wider. General Raymond Holt was 56 years old, with the kind of face that had stopped being young so gradually that it was difficult to imagine it ever having been. He had the build of a man who had once been physically imposing and had converted that into something denser and more deliberate with age. He looked up from his document with the measured attention of someone who had trained himself out of reactive expressions, a man who had learned that the first thing his face did in response to a surprise was information, and information was something he controlled. What his face did when he saw Elena was register her, categorize her, and wait. "Captain," he said. His voice was even. "This room is restricted during planning cycles." "I know, sir." She stepped inside. "I need 2 minutes." From behind her, Colonel Briggs's voice came down the corridor, sharp and immediate, the voice of a man who had seen the light under the general's door and was already moving. "Captain Marsh." He appeared in the doorway a half-second later, took in the scene, and his expression compressed into something controlled and very cold. "I told you to file that and go to bed." "You did, sir." "Then what are you—" "Colonel." General Holt's voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. "Let her speak." Briggs stopped. The general set his red pen down and removed his reading glasses and gave Elena the particular quality of attention that senior commanders reserved for things they had not yet decided how to feel about. It was not warm. It was not hostile. It was precise. 2 minutes, he said. "Start." Elena set the logistics report on the table in front of him. She opened it to page 11. She did not apologize for being there. She did not preface what she was about to say with anything that softened it or contextualized it or asked permission for it to be taken seriously. She simply began. The ingress route for Ironclad uses the eastern drainage corridor between grid references XT-447 and XT-451. This logistics report, distributed to the operations cell 9 days ago, documents sustained above-average rainfall across that corridor over the past 2 weeks. Based on the gradient and soil retention data in the report, the lower section of the corridor is holding between 60 and 90 centimeters of standing water. The assault vehicles have a fording depth of 50 centimeters under operational load. The approach is impassable. She stopped. The room was quiet. General Holt looked at the page in front of him. He did not look at it the way Briggs had. He looked at it the way a man does when he is actually reading something, when his eyes are moving and his mind is moving with them. He turned to the gradient notation. He found the rainfall figures. He followed the numbers without asking her to walk him through them. Briggs spoke from the doorway. "Sir, this report was not part of the verified planning materials. Captain Marsh accessed the full operational brief without authorization." "The brief was on the conference table," Elena said, without heat. "It hadn't been filed. I was in the records room." "That's not the point." "Dennis." The general didn't raise his voice. Briggs stopped again. Holt looked up from the report. He looked at Elena. "You ran the calculation yourself?" "Yes, sir, twice." "Walk me through it." She did. She laid it out the same way she had laid it out for Briggs, except that this time the person across the table was following every step, asking one precise question after the gradient calculation, another after the retention coefficient, not because he doubted her arithmetic, but because he was checking the logic at each joint, the way an engineer checks a load-bearing structure. She answered every question without hesitation. When she finished, the general sat back. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. In that room, at that hour, with 14, now 13 hours to launch, 4 seconds was a very long time. Then the door opened wider and Sergeant Major Diaz stepped in. He had not been summoned. He had simply arrived, in the way that Diaz tended to arrive at things, with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew where he needed to be. He was carrying his own copy of the logistics report. He had printed it from his terminal, and the relevant section was already tabbed. "Sir," he said to the general, "I pulled the rainfall data independently about 40 minutes ago. Her numbers are right." He set his copy on the table beside Elena's. "I also cross-referenced with the regional infrastructure assessment from last month. The corridor drainage capacity at current saturation is well below what the approach requires." The general looked at Diaz's copy. He looked at Elena's. He looked at Colonel Briggs. Something moved across Briggs's face, a rapid, involuntary sequence that began with resistance and passed through several stages before arriving at the particular stillness of a man recalibrating. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made an assumption and acted on it, and was now standing in the room where that assumption was being taken apart in front of his commanding officer. He said nothing. General Holt stood up. He walked to the planning board and looked at the operational map for a long moment. The ingress route marked in red. The corridor stretch that Elena had identified, bracketed by the 2 grid references she'd cited. He stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, and the room held its breath around him. "Who verified the route?" he asked. Not accusatory, just factual. "Major Okafor's cell handled terrain verification, sir," Briggs said. His voice was level. "The drainage corridor wasn't flagged as a road surface. It was classified as natural terrain cover. The logistics report went to this cell 9 days ago." "Yes, sir." "And nobody cross-referenced it against the route plan." It wasn't a question. Briggs answered it anyway. "No, sir." Holt turned from the board. He looked at Elena, a direct, assessing look, the kind that took a full inventory. Then he looked at Diaz, who met it with the steady patience of a man who had nothing to apologize for and nothing to prove. "Get Okafor," the general said. "Get the route planning team. I want an alternate ingress identified and verified in the next 4 hours. We use the northern access road. It adds distance, but it's paved, and it's been inspected." He picked up the logistics report. "And I want to know how a document this operationally relevant sat in a filing stack for 9 days without anyone reading it." Briggs said, "Yes, sir," and moved. The room began filling. Okafor's cell, the communications officer, the logistics lead. Maps came down and went back up. Voices overlapped in the controlled, purposeful way of people who had been handed a problem with a clock attached and had accepted the terms. Elena stepped back toward the door, out of the way of the movement around the table. Her part in this was done. The data was on the table. The right person had looked at it. The decision had been made. That was the whole of what she had come to do. She was almost through the door when one of the junior planners, a captain she recognized from the briefing sessions, a man named Rourke, looked up from the map he'd just unrolled and said to the officer beside him, not quietly enough, "Who is she again? Admin?" The officer beside him shrugged. Diaz, passing behind them both with a fresh set of terrain overlays, said without breaking stride, "Read her file, Captain, both of you." Rourke looked after him. Then he looked at Elena, who was already through the door. In the corridor outside, she let out a long, slow breath. The bass hum was different now, sharper, recalibrated, the frequency of an organism that had been redirected. She could hear the planning session beginning behind her, the measured urgency of it, the particular sound of capable people working a problem they could still solve. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went back to the records room, filed the operational brief where it belonged, and went to get some sleep. The mission launched at 0300. Elena knew because she was awake. She had slept for 4 hours, cleanly, without difficulty, the way she had learned to sleep in places where sleep was a resource you managed, rather than something that happened to you. And she woke at 0240 and lay still in her bunk for a moment, listening to the bass around her shift into the particular register that meant assets were moving. She did not go to watch. That wasn't her place, and she knew it. She lay in the dark and ran the northern access route in her head. The added distance, the approach angle, the way the paved road would give the vehicles consistent traction in the pre-dawn hours. She ran it the way she used to run things, in the part of her life before Bahrain, before the logistics coordination posting, before FOB Keller and its coffee machine and its HDMI cable that needed to be held at a specific angle. She ran it and found it sound. Then she went back to sleep. The operation succeeded. She found out at 0700, the way everyone at FOB Keller found out, through the controlled release of information that moved from the operations cell outward in concentric rings, each ring receiving slightly less detail than the one before it. The target had been secured. The assault team was back inside the wire. No casualties on their side. The compound had been taken with the kind of efficiency that came from a plan that had held together all the way to execution. The base exhaled. There was no celebration, not the loud kind anyway. Operational units didn't tend toward that. What happened instead was a loosening, a slight drop in the ambient tension that had been building for days, visible in the way people held their shoulders and the speed at which they moved through the corridors. Someone brought a box of pastries to the operations cell. Major Gaines ate 2 of them at his desk and didn't care who saw. Elena distributed the morning briefing folders and made the coffee and held the HDMI cable at its angle, and the day moved forward. She was at her desk at 09:30, working through a stack of post-operation administrative filings, when she became aware that the operations cell had gone slightly quieter than usual. Not silent, just quieter in the specific way that meant attention had collected somewhere. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, she saw Captain Rourke standing near the corridor entrance with a tablet in his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her since she'd arrived at FOB Keller. It wasn't the comfortable categorizing look she'd gotten used to, the look that placed her behind the coffee tray and left her there. It was more careful than that, more uncertain. He looked back down at his tablet, then at her again. He said, to no one in particular, "Did anyone actually read her file?" The question landed in the quiet of the cell and sat there. Captain Ewan, at the desk adjacent to Elena's, looked up. "What's in it?" Rourke appeared to be deciding how to answer that. He set the tablet down on the nearest surface and said, 3 deployments, 2 in direct support of Special Operations Task Forces. A pause. She was an intelligence analyst, not a general one. She was attached to a Tier 1 unit for 14 months. Ewan was very still. "There's a commendation in there from a full-bird colonel in JSOC. Rourke looked at the tablet again, as though confirming that it still said what it had said. "And a classified operational notation I don't have the clearance to open." The cell was quiet. Elena kept her eyes on the filing in front of her. Her pen moved at its regular pace. "The Bahrain posting," Rourke continued, more slowly now, working through it as he spoke. "That wasn't a logistics coordination unit. It was a cover designation for a joint intelligence cell supporting cross-border operations." He set the tablet down entirely. "She wasn't transferred here because she was surplus. She was reassigned here specifically. The order came from 2 levels above Briggs." Ewan turned and looked at Elena directly. She looked up, met his eyes, said nothing. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Elena considered the question for a moment with the same care she applied to everything. "You didn't ask," she said. "Colonel Briggs came to her desk at 10:15. He did it without sending anyone ahead of him, without a summons or a formal setting. He simply appeared beside her desk with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged into the expression of a man performing a task he had assigned himself because it was the correct thing to do, and he was, above all things, a man who did the correct thing. "Captain Marsh," he said. "Sir." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the operations cell maintained its business with the focused discretion of people who were absolutely listening. "The route change last night," he said. "It was the right call. The drainage corridor was inspected this morning by the follow-on element." A pause. "Your assessment was accurate." Elena said, "Thank you, sir." Another pause. Briggs was not a man built for this particular kind of conversation. He had a precise and functional relationship with accountability. He could accept it, could name it, could do the formal work of it. But the human texture of it cost him something, and it showed. "I should have looked at the data when you brought it to me," he said. "I didn't. That was an error in judgment on my part." Elena looked at him steadily. "You had no reason to expect the analysis from someone in my role, sir. It was not absolution. It was just accurate, and they both knew it." Briggs held her gaze for a moment and gave a short nod, the nod of a man who understood the distinction, and then he unclasped his hands and walked back to his office. The cell exhaled very quietly. Lieutenant Garvey, across the room, had found something extremely interesting to look at on his monitor. He did not look up for a long time. The general came at 1100. Elena knew he was coming before she saw him because Diaz appeared first, not hurrying, just arriving ahead, the way he had a habit of doing. He stopped at the edge of the operations cell, looked at Elena once, and gave her a small nod that contained several things at once. Confirmation, something that might have been satisfaction, and the particular acknowledgement that passes between people who have both been in rooms where things went wrong and have both made the choice to say something anyway. Then General Holt walked in. The cell responded the way cells do. Attention sharpening, postures adjusting, the unconscious alignment of people in the presence of rank. Holt moved through it without acknowledging it, which was its own kind of authority, and he stopped in front of Elena's desk. She stood. He looked at her for a moment, the same direct, inventorying look he'd given her the night before, except that this time it contained something additional that the late-hour version hadn't had room for. "I read your file this morning," he said. Elena said nothing. "I should have read it before you arrived." He said it simply, without the performance of contrition. Just a fact he was stating because it was true, and because he was the kind of man who stated true things, even the ones that reflected poorly on him. "You were sent here for a reason. I didn't know what the reason was because I didn't look. The reassignment came through standard channels, sir. There was no reason to—" "There is always a reason to know who is in your command, Captain." His voice wasn't sharp. It was the voice of a man correcting himself, not her. He looked around the operations cell for a moment, at Briggs's closed office door, at Rourke and Ewan at their desks, at the planning board still showing the modified ironclad route. And then he looked back at Elena. "The operation succeeded," he said, "partly because of what you did last night." A brief pause. "Largely, if we're being precise about it." Elena said, "Diaz confirmed the data, sir. He deserves—" "Diaz confirmed it. You found it." Holt held her gaze. "That distinction matters." She didn't argue. The general reached past her and pulled the second chair from beside her desk, not the folding side chair, but the full desk chair that sat to her left, the one that had been empty since she arrived because her desk abutted the planning table and nobody had thought to assign anyone to the adjacent seat. He set it at the planning table, not beside it, not angled toward it. At it, pulled up flush, facing the operational map on the south wall, positioned between the chair where Colonel Briggs sat and the chair where Major Okafor ran terrain verification. He looked at Elena. "Starting with the next planning cycle," he said, "I want you at this table, not filing, not on the attendance roster." He glanced at the logistics report, which was still sitting on the corner of the planning table from the night before, nobody having moved it. "I want you reading the materials that matter and telling me when something doesn't add up." Elena looked at the chair. She looked at the planning table, the maps, the overlays, the operational architecture of a forward base doing the serious, consequential work of making decisions that affected lives. She had sat at tables like this before, in other rooms, under other designations that didn't appear on the paperwork people normally read. She had missed it. She hadn't said so. She hadn't said much of anything. In the 2 weeks since she arrived, beyond what was asked of her. She had held the HDMI cable at its angle and left the east corridor 2 minutes late and arranged the chairs and waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that the right moment is not the same as the first available moment. "Yes, sir," she said. She walked to the table and sat down. Diaz, from across the room, said nothing, but the expression on his face, brief, contained, and completely unambiguous, said everything that needed saying. Garvey looked at his monitor. The operations cell moved around her the way it always had. Folders distributed, communications checked, the morning's work continuing in its rhythm. Except that now, at the planning table, there was one more chair occupied, one more set of eyes on the operational map, one more person in the room who was not simply present, but paying attention. The logistics report sat at the corner of the table. Nobody filed it.